The Banwell family's adoption seemed peculiar enough. Only left-handed children were ever welcomed into their home. But in every death photo, each child's right hand told a far more disturbing story. The Banwell family adopted only left-handed children, but all were right in their death photos. What if innocence itself was only a mask, a fragile veil stretched thin over something cold and calculating? In the heart of 19th-century Somerset, the Banwell family built a reputation that seemed beyond reproach. They were whispered about with admiration at Sunday services, praised in the village square, spoken of as God's chosen caretakers of the abandoned. While others turned away from children considered defective, cursed, or marked by superstition, the Banwells opened their doors. It was said they had hearts too soft for the world, hearts that could not endure the thought of a child unloved. Neighbors told stories of their carriages arriving at orphanages, of small hands reaching out from crumbling walls to be lifted into safety. To those who saw only the surface, the Banwells seemed like a miracle stitched into human form. Left-handedness in that time was more than inconvenience. It was a stain, a whisper of devilry, an ill omen passed down from ancient fear. The church spoke softly of it as a crookedness of the soul, something that might be corrected with discipline, while neighbors muttered that such children were destined for misfortune. Parents with few means felt justified in giving them away, and the Banwells, draped in smiles, stepped forward as saviors. They arrived at workhouses and orphanages with promises of bread, warmth, and schooling. They whispered to weary matrons that no child should be punished for something so small. They convinced mothers who wept that the child would be safe in their care. Few dared question their generosity, for in an age where charity was rare, suspicion was easily silenced. Inside the Banwell home, the atmosphere was curated with precision. Visitors entered drawing rooms where firelight flickered against polished silver, where portraits of ancestors gazed down in solemn benevolence. The matron, Mrs. Banwell, always greeted with gentle words and delicate tea poured into fragile cups, while her husband, stern but kind to the outside world, spoke with weighty compassion about God's call to rescue the unwanted. Children were paraded briefly before guests, dressed neatly, their left hands hidden in clever folds of fabric or positioned behind their backs in ways no one noticed. Everything seemed ordered, respectable, moral. Yet the more perfectly arranged a space, the more carefully rehearsed a kindness, the more it conceals. The Banwell home was not a place of rescue, but a theater of illusion. The deeper truth, however, was a fascination bordering on obsession. To the Banwells, left-handedness was not a defect to be erased but a puzzle to be unraveled, a secret code written upon the body. They saw themselves as collectors, curators of human imperfection, harvesting children whose difference could be studied, molded, tested in ways that society dared not speak aloud. There was a ritualistic quality to their choices. Adoption records were kept in neat ledgers with symbols marking each name, a small flourish beside the entries of those deemed especially promising. The Banwells did not see themselves as cruel, they saw themselves as chosen, as guardians of a truth no one else had the courage to face. Behind every smile was the conviction that they were performing God's work, though the God they served had long ceased to resemble the one worshipped in church. Their home became a stage for this performance of kindness. Servants who might have noticed too much were carefully chosen, often illiterate, often desperate for wages, and they knew better than to question locked doors or muffled cries that could be dismissed as nightmares. The Banwells moved through their halls with grace, offering blessings to neighbors, attending church in perfect attire, never missing a sermon, always leading prayers for the fatherless and the forgotten. Their piety was armor, and behind that armor lay freedom. The villagers whispered about their goodness so often that the notion of doubt began to feel like sin itself. To question the Banwells was to question the very possibility of human charity. The psychology of such evil was not loud, not wild, but patient. It thrived in silence, in the careful blending of cruelty with calm. The Banwells understood that society does not fear the monster that smiles. It fears the beggar, the thief, the unkempt. By presenting themselves as the opposite of menace, they created immunity against suspicion. And in this immunity lay freedom. They could continue for years, perhaps decades, unnoticed, their reputation growing stronger with every orphan welcomed into their home. They learned quickly that the more they were praised, the more invisible their darkness became. For the children, the first days often held a sweetness crueler than any lash. They were given warm beds, food beyond their imagining, clothes stitched with care. They were told they were wanted, that they were special, that God had chosen them for a new beginning. This kindness was not a lie exactly, but a snare, a conditioning that taught the child to accept the Banwells as saviors. The deeper cruelty was that trust itself became the tool, the gift that bound them. The Banwells took joy in watching fear melt into relief, in watching wide eyes grow soft with hope. To them, the breaking of the spirit did not begin with pain but with comfort. For it is far more devastating to crush what has first been allowed to bloom. As the days stretched into weeks, the mask of tenderness never faltered in the public eye. Villagers who caught glimpses of the children saw them walking quietly in gardens, their heads bowed, their movements disciplined, and they assumed gratitude. They did not see the invisible chains of fear, the rules carved into flesh, the strange rituals that governed every action once the doors were closed. The Banwells knew the world would not look too closely. They knew that society preferred a comforting lie to an unbearable truth. And so they continued, polishing their mask, perfecting their performance, rehearsing their lines until kindness itself became the weapon that concealed everything. This was the first mask of the Banwells, a household of charity, polished and proper, draped in the language of grace. It was a mask so convincing that even years later, when fragments of their deeds would surface, there were those who refused to believe. But behind that mask, in the quiet of their chambers, a new cruelty was taking shape, one that would twist not only flesh but spirit, one that would leave behind a legacy of silence and shadows. The story of the Banwells was never about kindness. It was about how easily the world confuses gentleness with safety, and how evil thrives best when dressed as love. And as the mask slipped ever so slightly, the next chapter of horror began to emerge, waiting to reveal itself. The Banwell estate stood like a jewel in the quiet Somerset countryside, its stone walls softened by ivy, its gardens spilling with roses and lavender that perfumed the air. To anyone who passed by, it was a place of warmth and prosperity, a home touched by grace. On Sundays the family was seen walking arm in arm, dressed with care, their heads bowed in reverence as the church bells tolled. Children's laughter could sometimes be heard across the hedge, and neighbors smiled, comforted by the belief that orphans had finally found a sanctuary. The house was christened by locals as the House of Gentle Hands, a name that carried the weight of kindness and holiness. Yet no one who entered through its gates as a child ever walked back out again. What the village noticed, though rarely spoke aloud, was a single oddity that seemed too delicate to question. Every child the Banwells adopted was left-handed. No exceptions, no variations. The rumor moved through the parish pews in whispers, drifting like smoke. Why only left-handed children? Some said it was coincidence, others that the Banwells had hearts large enough to take the ones others scorned. When asked, the family would only smile in their polished way, lowering their voices to a pious murmur, saying it was God's little distinction. That answer was enough. Who could argue with God, or with a family so revered for their sacrifices? But the repetition of the detail carved itself into memory, always left-handed, never otherwise. Inside the estate, the illusion of tenderness was rehearsed with the skill of theater. Visitors saw tidy nurseries with wooden toys aligned in neat rows, books arranged upon shelves, and embroidered samplers hung upon the walls. Each room carried the faint smell of beeswax polish and fresh linens, the signature of a household managed with care. Mrs. Banwell would guide guests through the halls with soft words, remarking on the children's progress, speaking of their shyness, explaining why they could not join the guests for long. The children, when shown, were pale and quiet, their hair combed, their clothing spotless. They gave no hint of distress beyond a silence too deep for their age, a silence mistaken for timidity. In truth, it was not shyness but training, a quiet carved into them by fear. The house itself became complicit in the deception. Its corridors muffled sound, its walls were thick, and its doors were heavy with locks. Behind them the air grew different, heavier, as if it carried secrets that could never touch the outside world. The children learned quickly that the gardens they glimpsed through windows were not for play, that the gates of the estate marked not freedom but boundaries. They became inhabitants of a gilded cage, where everything looked gentle but pressed in upon them like a closing fist. For the Banwells, the estate was more than a home. It was a laboratory of belief, a sanctuary where their theories about handedness could be tested without interference. Each child brought through the doors was chosen, not by accident but by design. They were considered material to be molded, symbols of imperfection that could be transformed into something purer. To the villagers, the children were fortunate. To the Banwells, they were instruments. The garden paths, the laughter that drifted from windows, the Sunday appearances at church, all of it was camouflage, a careful presentation that allowed their work to remain unseen. The psychology behind this cruelty was steeped in patience. The Banwells did not begin with violence. They began with routine, with rules so small that they seemed harmless. A child was asked to pick up a spoon with the right hand. A book was placed in front of them, and they were instructed to turn the page from right to left. Failure brought correction, not yet pain but disapproval, a tightening of the lips, a coldness in the air that suffocated like ice. These were rehearsals, exercises in control. Gradually, small mistakes were met with sharper consequences, but never in ways that could leave marks easily seen. The cruelty was invisible, like a shadow that moved across the room but never left proof of its passing. Neighbors sometimes wondered at the stillness of the Banwell children when glimpsed in the garden. They walked with measured steps, their hands folded, their eyes lowered. They seemed more like processions than children, their play absent, their laughter muted. But the villagers, rather than feel alarm, admired their discipline. It was easier to believe that the Banwells had instilled virtue than to imagine something darker. The illusion of goodness was so complete that it replaced suspicion with reverence. The estate thrived on this blindness. Every Sunday, when the Banwells appeared at church with their brood of quiet children, it became a performance no one questioned. The family prayed with fervor, their voices clear, their reputations shining brighter with each display of piety. And every time another child vanished into their walls, society applauded them for their courage. Evil had never worn such a convincing mask. For the children, each day blurred into the next, and the house grew heavier the longer they remained. The silence of their own kind became oppressive, for they were never allowed to speak freely, never allowed to form the bonds that might have given them strength. Isolation became its own form of punishment, dividing them from one another, making them easier to control. They learned to hold their left hands stiffly behind them, to pretend they were something they were not, to play roles just as their captors did. Their very bodies became performances in the theater of the Banwells. The locals, in their ignorance, saw only the gardens and the laughter carried on the wind. They called it the House of Gentle Hands, never knowing how bitterly the name mocked the truth. For within those walls, hands were bound, broken, reshaped not with gentleness but with control. What seemed to outsiders like charity was, in truth, the first act of a ritual far more chilling. The Banwells had prepared the stage, dressed it with flowers, filled it with prayers, and cloaked it in goodness. Now the true performance could begin, hidden from the world that trusted them blindly. And so the mask held, as the estate continued to gather children under its roof, left-handed and unwanted, each one swallowed by the house that promised kindness. Beyond the roses and hymns, the quiet cruelty deepened, and step by step, the Banwells moved closer to revealing the true nature of their work. When the doors of the Banwell estate closed and the glow of charity was no longer needed, the true philosophy of the household revealed itself in silence and shadow. To the Banwells, left-handedness was not simply a minor difference. It was a defect, a stain, a mark of crookedness etched into the flesh by forces unseen. But unlike the church, which warned against such children with quiet sermons, the Banwells believed themselves chosen to correct the imperfection. They imagined themselves as surgeons of the soul, tasked with reshaping what God had allowed to go wrong. And their methods, hidden from every eye but their own, were ritualized acts of cruelty dressed in the language of correction. The rituals always began with ceremony. The child was led into a room lit too brightly, stripped of shadows, where the family stood as solemn as priests. An iron quill, heated until it glowed faintly red, was pressed into the child's right hand. They were told to write their name, to trace letters across thick parchment. Their left hand, bound tightly in ice-filled cloths, burned with cold until skin split and numbed. The act was not only about forcing right-handed writing but about creating an association between left and suffering, right and survival. The Banwells recorded each attempt in ledgers with neat lines of script, as though they were documenting a scientific trial. A single misshaped letter was followed by correction, punishment, and notes in margins. To them these were not screams. These were data. But this was only the beginning. The Banwells constructed chambers designed to force conformity through environment. Small rooms, windowless and damp, were filled with objects rigged to demand right-handed use. Doorknobs placed only on the right side. Candles lit in recesses that could only be reached with the right hand. Toys and tools aligned to punish the left, innocent-looking balls that revealed hidden needles if touched incorrectly, or locks that snapped on wrists when opened with the wrong hand. The child, stripped of choice, learned that their body itself betrayed them. Each mistake was met not with a shout but with a chilling patience, a tightening of the system that left no doubt. The left hand was a curse, the right the only means of survival. The cruelty grew more elaborate as the Banwells' obsession deepened. They fashioned contraptions from wood and iron, devices that forced bodies into positions of symmetry, twisting joints until the child's left side screamed with pain while the right was spared. Hours passed in these positions, bones reshaping under the strain, muscles trembling until collapse. The Banwells called these alignments, whispering prayers as if the breaking of a body was the cleansing of a soul. They believed suffering could peel away the defect, layer by layer, until the child emerged corrected, wholly redeemed. Yet no child ever left the chamber whole. The philosophy behind these horrors was not random but methodical. The Banwells were convinced that evil was written into the left hand, and that only through ritual could it be excised. They blended religion with their own dark logic, creating rites that mimicked baptism, confirmation, even communion, but twisted into grotesque parodies. Instead of holy water, the left hand was plunged into ice until the skin blistered and peeled. Instead of confirmation oils, heated irons pressed into flesh-marked obedience. Instead of bread, the children were made to swallow scraps of parchment on which they had scrawled their names with the trembling right hand, choking on the evidence of their forced transformation. These rituals blurred the line between punishment and worship until they became one and the same. What made the cruelty most devastating was the calmness with which it was delivered. The Banwells never shouted. They never struck in anger. Every action was measured, deliberate, as though they were not tormentors but caretakers following a sacred manual. They spoke softly while inflicting agony, soothing the child with words of grace even as the ice cut into skin or the iron branded flesh. The duality was unbearable, the tone of love married to the act of cruelty. It taught the children that pain itself was love, that correction was kindness, that the hands that harmed them were also the only hands that might save them. This confusion was the Banwells' true mastery. They did not just break the body, they broke the meaning of comfort. Some children resisted longer than others, clinging to their natural instincts, refusing to yield. For them, the punishments escalated. The Banwells locked them in isolation chambers where every surface was designed to betray them. Levers snapped shut on the left wrist. Small hidden blades cut shallow lines into skin when an object was lifted incorrectly. Even the act of sleep was weaponized, beds rigged so that shifting to the left side triggered sharp prods against ribs, ensuring the child could never rest in their natural posture. Days blurred into nights, and exhaustion became another tool of correction. By the time the children emerged, their instincts had been shattered, their fear of the left hand etched deeper than bone. And yet, despite the screams, despite the tears, the Banwells always recorded the results with detachment. Ledgers filled with lines of script noted progress, regression, and failure. Words like obedient, resistant, and corrected appeared beside names. It was as if the children were no longer people but specimens, experiments catalogued in the pursuit of a twisted truth. The House of Gentle Hands had become a laboratory of torment, its walls echoing with sounds muffled too carefully for neighbors to hear. The most disturbing element was that the Banwells believed themselves merciful. They told themselves that every scar was a step toward salvation, every broken bone a lesson in discipline, every cry of pain a hymn offered to God. They did not see cruelty in their actions. They saw devotion. And in this conviction lay the true horror, for evil wrapped in righteousness is far more enduring than evil alone. The children who survived the rituals carried the marks not only on their skin but in their minds. They walked stiffly, favoring the right hand even when alone, terrified of betraying themselves to an unseen eye. They flinched at their own impulses, doubting their own bodies. They became reflections of the Banwell's obsession, hollow vessels trained to perform obedience. And yet, beneath the quiet, their silence screamed, a silence that would later haunt the very halls the Banwells decorated with prayer. The rituals of correction were not accidents, nor momentary cruelties. They were the heart of the Banwell philosophy, the hidden religion of a family that clothed itself in innocence. The estate that seemed filled with warmth was in truth a shrine, and the children its sacrifices. With each ritual, the Banwells grew more certain of their righteousness, more confident that the world would never suspect. And with each broken child, the mask of kindness grew thicker, convincing even those who might have glimpsed the truth. The story of the Banwells was no longer about adoption or charity. It was about control, about reshaping the very essence of a child until nothing remained but obedience to a doctrine that no one outside their walls could understand. The House of Gentle Hands had revealed its true nature, a house of ritual, a house of correction, a house where innocence was not preserved but dismantled piece by piece. And as the rituals grew darker, the line between punishment and worship blurred beyond recognition, carrying the Banwells deeper into a darkness that even they no longer feared. The Banwells did not let their rituals fade into memory. Every act of correction, every moment of obedience carved into a child's body, was documented with a devotion that bordered on worship. Their home contained a chamber unlike any other, a gallery they guarded with more care than even their bedchambers. Behind locked doors and drawn curtains, the gallery of stillness grew. It began with painted portraits, then moved into crude photographs as the century advanced, each image a testament not to life, but to control. The children were always posed with their right hands displayed, pressed against their chests, folded in their laps, or resting on a book. Never the left. The stillness of their bodies was haunting, too stiff, too quiet, as though something essential had already been taken from them. These images were not keepsakes but relics of victory. The Banwells believed each portrait captured a soul halfway corrected, a frozen moment of triumph over defect. They studied the photographs late at night, holding lanterns close to the faces, murmuring about progress and failure, debating which child had submitted most completely to the discipline of the right. They would compare early sketches with later images, tracing the transformation with satisfaction, noting how fear had drained rebellion from the eyes. The gallery was their scripture, a visual record of suffering disguised as progress. Yet photographs and paintings were not enough. The Banwells desired more permanence than pigment or paper could provide. They devised contraptions of wood and mirror, cages where children were strapped until their reflections distorted into grotesque symmetry. Limbs bent in unnatural positions, shoulders dislocated, spines twisted, all in the name of creating perfect right-handed mirrors of themselves. These sessions lasted for hours, sometimes days, until the children's bodies collapsed from the strain. The Banwells would then sketch these positions, capturing the unnatural geometries as though they were diagrams of holy architecture. In their eyes, the children became blueprints of spiritual repair, models of a symmetry no natural body had ever been meant to endure. For those who resisted, the Banwells turned the gallery into a place of punishment itself. The walls were lined with images of the broken and obedient, and a child brought inside was forced to kneel beneath the gaze of those portraits, left hand shackled, right hand raised in forced salute. They were surrounded by silence, the air thick with dust and the faint scent of chemicals used in photography. To kneel in that chamber was to be buried alive under the weight of other children's suffering, to see what submission looked like frozen in time. It was a psychological torture more refined than any lash, for it taught the child that resistance would not only fail but would be immortalized as shame. The Gallery of Stillness also served as the Banwells' private sanctuary. They visited it as others might visit a chapel. They lit candles before the portraits, whispered prayers to the images, and caressed the frames as though they were holy relics. The children depicted within were no longer individuals. They had become saints of correction, martyrs of the Banwell Creed. The family spoke of them as examples, using their names like verses and sermons. To live in the Banwell home was to know that one day your likeness would join the gallery, your body frozen in stillness, your left hand hidden forever. The horror of this ritual was not only in the physical torment but in the erasure of identity. The children's smiles, when forced, were thin and brittle, masking terror beneath a fragile facade. Their eyes revealed the truth, wide and empty, staring into the lens as if pleading for someone to see them, to rescue them, to remember them as more than an artifact. But no one outside those walls ever looked. No one ever saw. The Banwells alone admired, judged, and celebrated these images, blind to the humanity they had stripped away. There were also artifacts more grotesque than portraits. The Banwells preserved fragments of their work in forms too disturbing to speak of openly. Strands of hair sealed in books beside photographs. Splinters of nails labeled in jars. Small casts of hands made in plaster, always the right hand, never the left. These objects filled shelves, each one a relic of correction. The family believed they had captured not only the child's body but the transformation of their soul, bottled and preserved for eternity. To them, the gallery was not a room of horror but of holiness, proof that they alone had dared to confront and cure the crookedness of the left. The children themselves became complicit, though unwillingly. They were led into the chamber one by one, dressed carefully, combed and scrubbed, posed for the camera or brush. They knew the stillness required of them, for hesitation brought punishment. They learned to hold their bodies rigid, to hide their trembling, to present themselves as obedient statues. For them, each sitting was an act of burial, a piece of their soul locked away forever. They dreaded the gallery not because of what it showed but because it reminded them of what they were becoming, hollow images stripped of movement, stripped of choice. And yet, the gallery also betrayed the Banwells' growing madness. The further their collection grew, the less it resembled children at all. The poses became stranger, the expressions more lifeless, the bodies positioned in unnatural symmetries that no free child could hold. Some images showed eyes closed as if in sleep, others mouths clamped shut with threads that glistened in the light. These details were explained away as artistic decisions, but they revealed something darker. The Banwells were not merely documenting obedience but manufacturing stillness itself, forcing children into death-like poses long before their deaths arrived. The villagers, of course, never knew of the gallery. They saw the Banwells as they always had, gentle, pious, charitable. They did not see the hidden chapel of suffering, the shrine of images where innocence was frozen and displayed like trophies. But the house carried an aura, and those few who stepped too close to its locked rooms sometimes whispered later of unease, of a chill that clung to their skin, of portraits that seemed to watch even when the eyes were closed. The Gallery of Stillness was not simply a room in a house. It was the heart of the Banwell philosophy, the physical embodiment of their madness. It was where cruelty was sanctified, where suffering was transformed into relic, where children were reduced to images, objects, and symbols. And as the collection grew, so too did the Banwell's conviction that they were not tormentors but saviors, chosen to immortalize their work in ways the world could never erase. The stillness of the gallery carried forward into the rest of the house. The children walked more stiffly, spoke less often, and obeyed with unnatural quiet. It was as though the portraits had bled into their flesh, freezing them before their time. The Banwells watched with pride, mistaking trauma for discipline, silence for holiness. They did not see brokenness, they saw proof that their rituals were working. And so the cycle continued, each child destined to join the gallery, each image another brick in the wall of their self-deception. Behind the locked doors of the Banwell estate, the gallery stood as a monument not to life but to absence, a sanctuary where children were not remembered but erased. It was a place where stillness became worship, where silence became scripture, and where cruelty wore the face of devotion. And as the candles burned low and the Banwells traced the images with trembling fingers, the line between remembrance and possession dissolved. The gallery was no longer just a room. It was their legacy, their altar, their shrine to a vision of correction that no one outside their home would ever believe. The Banwell's rituals of correction had always carried the illusion of discipline, a grotesque parody of reform cloaked in patience. But correction was never the true end. The rituals were only the prelude. What the Banwell sought most was the silence that followed, the silence of complete surrender, the silence that lingered when the body no longer moved, when resistance had been extinguished. Death was not an accident in the Banwell household. It was the harvest, the inevitable outcome of their philosophy, reaped with a precision as methodical as their ledgers. The deaths were not swift nor careless. They were performances staged with care, each one tailored to the child's resistance, each one carried out with a symbolic cruelty that bound body, spirit, and doctrine together. For some, the punishment came in the form of drowning, but even that was no ordinary act. The Banwells constructed narrow coffins lined with glass and filled them with water. A child was placed inside, right hand unbound, left hand shackled at the side. They were forced to scratch at the glass with their free hand, their fingernails clawing desperately for escape until exhaustion overtook them. The Banwells watched as though witnessing a ritual baptism, recording the time it took for silence to fall. When the body stilled, the family murmured prayers of release, convinced they had purged the crookedness forever. Others became living instruments of time. Wooden wheels were built, large and crude, with iron nails fixed along their rims. A child's left arm would be nailed into place at the center, while the wheel rotated slowly, turning their body again and again in an endless cycle. The Banwells timed their cries, marking each rotation as if it were the striking of a clock. The screams became chimes, the suffering a rhythm. The ritual ended not when the cries stopped but when the wheel itself fell silent, when the body could no longer move to mark the hours. These children became clocks of flesh, their torment measured like minutes, their silence a final toll. There were deaths designed to be seen only by the Banwells, deaths carried out in secret chambers where no servant dared to linger. One method involved rooms lined entirely with chalkboards. A child was given a single piece of chalk in their right hand and told to copy verses without stopping. Their left hand was chained behind them, a dead weight. Every time the chalk broke, the Banwells replaced it with another, forcing the hand to cramp, forcing the body to continue until exhaustion collapsed them onto the floor. The chalk dust filled their lungs, choking them slowly, smothering them in the very lesson they were meant to learn. When they finally stilled, the walls stood covered in half-finished words, a ghostly scripture of resistance and collapse. The Banwells believed that death under these circumstances was not failure but transcendence. They told themselves that the child had been purified in suffering, that their silence was proof of correction complete. This was why the deaths were preserved, not hidden. Every coffin, every wheel, every chalk-covered room was meticulously cleaned but never dismantled. The tools of killing remained, ready for the next child, sanctified as instruments of reform. The family's devotion to this practice was not tinged with regret. It was steeped in pride. They even carried fragments of the dead with them into their daily lives. Bones polished into rosary beads, finger joints carved into charms, strands of hair braided into ribbons kept in family Bibles. Each piece was treated as a relic, a reminder of the work they had accomplished. When neighbors saw rosaries in the Banwells' hands at church, they never imagined that the beads had once belonged to the very children praised in sermons. To the congregation, the Banwells appeared as the most devout among them. Only the Banwells knew that their prayers were whispered over bones. The most devastating part of the harvest was the deception that followed. Deaths were never reported as such. The Banwells claimed that children had been placed with relatives, or had fallen ill and been sent quietly away. Some said the children were apprenticed in distant towns, others that they had been called to service by unseen benefactors. The village accepted these stories without question. Who would suspect a family so respected, so pious, of anything but kindness? And so, silence spread outward, carried not just by death but by belief, a silence that shielded the Banwells more effectively than any locked door. For the surviving children, the harvest left scars deeper than flesh. They lived each day with the knowledge that silence could claim them next, that their turn would come when resistance faltered or when the Banwells deemed them ready. The air in the estate grew heavy with dread, the sound of weeping replaced by a quiet more unbearable than screams. Each empty bed was a reminder, each missing face a lesson in obedience. The children learned to walk as shadows, to breathe as little as possible, to vanish into themselves. They became ghosts long before their deaths, hollowed by fear and waiting for the harvest to take them. The psychology of the Banwells in these moments revealed its full depth of pathology. They did not see murder, they saw ritual completion. They believed themselves as gardeners pulling weeds, as surgeons excising sickness, as priests releasing souls into purity. Their calmness, their devotion, their methodical recording of each death was not madness in their own minds but clarity. They had redefined cruelty into sanctity, killing into correction, silence into salvation. And in this conviction, they stripped death of its horror for themselves, even as they magnified it for the children. Yet even the Banwells could not escape the presence of the dead entirely. The house grew saturated with it. Shadows lingered in corners. The air carried whispers that servants claimed to hear but never dared to mention. The gallery of stillness expanded to include not only portraits of the living but images of the dead, arranged to appear serene, always with the right hand posed prominently. Visitors never saw these images, but the Banwells gazed at them often, finding comfort in the illusion that the children had finally been set right. The gallery became both shrine and tomb, its silence echoing louder than any voice. The harvest of silence became the rhythm of the Banwell estate. Each ritual ended the same way, with stillness that spread through the house like a contagion. The family lived within it, nourished by it, convinced that it was proof of divine approval. But for the children, it was a suffocating weight, an endless reminder that their bodies and voices were not their own. Silence had become the currency of the house, and every child knew that one day the Banwells would claim theirs. The cruelty of the Banwells was not in the taking of life alone but in the way they turned death into ritual, silence into victory, suffering into scripture. They did not kill in rage or impulse. They killed with patience, with devotion, with a calmness more terrifying than fury. Their evil was not the chaos of madness but the order of belief, the methodical conviction that what they did was righteous. And as long as the village praised them, as long as the church held them in esteem, they knew their harvest would continue unchecked, the silence of their victims swallowed by the silence of a society too blind to see. The Banwells' cruelty was hidden beneath a costume so convincing that even the most watchful eyes in Somerset failed to pierce it. To the world beyond their gates, the family were saints. Their estate, with its chimneys smoking gently at dawn and its gardens bursting with color, seemed the embodiment of Christian charity. They gave generously to the parish, funded repairs for the crumbling schoolhouse, and paid for hymn books in the local church. Every Sunday they occupied the front pew, their heads bowed, their children, those still living, lined in neat rows behind them. The silence of those children, mistaken for discipline, was admired. Parents with unruly sons whispered that they wished they could learn from the Banwells' example. The illusion of charity was so carefully tended that it grew into legend. The family did not stop with reputation alone. They built institutions that secured their image in stone. A small schoolhouse for orphans carried their name, its entrance adorned with carved scripture that praised the meek and the humble. They donated to the poor, distributing bread and blankets during harsh winters, though never too generously, just enough to sustain admiration without raising suspicion about their true wealth. Villagers believed the Banwells lived not for themselves but for the children of others. They became symbols of compassion in an age when compassion was scarce. Yet behind the public displays of piety, their halls remained prisons, their acts of kindness a smoke screen thick enough to choke truth itself. The children never appeared in town except under careful watch. When they did, they were silent, eyes lowered, hands folded properly at the front. Their left hands were bound beneath gloves or hidden in pockets, disguised as modesty. No one questioned why none of them laughed, why none ever strayed to play with other children. Instead, neighbors marveled at their composure. The villagers could not see the fear etched into their posture, the weight of dread that bent their shoulders. To question it would have required breaking the comforting illusion, and comfort was preferable to doubt. The Banwells understood this, and they nurtured it, feeding the village the image of perfect charity until suspicion itself seemed like a sin. Whispers still existed, faint and fragile, drifting from those who noticed inconsistencies. Servants who left the estate spoke of strange sounds at night, muffled cries, and fires in the chimneys at odd hours. A few mothers wondered aloud why no Banwell child ever seemed to grow into adulthood within the village, why those adopted never returned for visits once they were said to have moved on. Yet these whispers found little ground to root in. The family's donations, their prayers, their ceaseless presence at every funeral and baptism, shielded them from scrutiny. Who would accuse the very people who clothed the poor of devouring the weak? To doubt them was to doubt the very idea of goodness itself. The psychology of their illusion was not accidental. The Banwells understood that true protection did not lie in secrecy but in spectacle. The more they paraded their piety, the less anyone wanted to believe the opposite. Their acts of public kindness became armor, and each good deed added another plate of steel to the mask. They spoke eloquently of sacrifice, of the burden of caring for children others abandoned. Their words rang with humility, but humility was the most calculated lie of all. Behind every sermon, every donation, every gesture of charity, was the certainty that society would rather cling to a beautiful lie than face an unbearable truth. And so the Banwells' illusion thrived. Their reputation reached beyond Somerset, spoken of in nearby towns as a model of Christian mercy. Other families sent them donations, believing their household to be a beacon of reform. Church leaders praised them in sermons, citing their dedication as proof that goodness still walked among men. The more death filled their home, the more accolades filled their ears. The mask of charity did not crack under the weight of cruelty. It hardened, calcified, until even whispers of doubt could not penetrate it. Yet within the estate, the illusion became suffocating even for those who created it. The children knew the truth but could not speak it, their voices strangled by fear. Servants carried suspicions but dared not voice them, knowing that to question their employers would mean ruin. Even the Banwells themselves, steeped in their rituals and pride, began to believe their own lie. They convinced themselves that the world needed them, that their cruelty was sanctified by the very admiration lavished upon them. In their minds, the illusion was not a disguise but proof of divine approval. The more society praised them, the more they believed their horrors were holy. The illusion of charity was not fragile. It was durable, stronger than suspicion, stronger than truth. It endured because people wanted it to endure. The villagers needed to believe in kindness. They needed saints to admire, examples to follow, a balm for the cruelties of their own world. And so they chose blindness, and in choosing blindness they became accomplices. The Banwells did not deceive alone. They were supported by a community that preferred illusion to reality. The silence outside the estate was as damning as the silence within it. And still the chimneys smoked, the gardens bloomed, the children walked with folded hands. The House of Gentle Hands stood as a monument not to mercy but to society's willingness to believe a lie. The illusion was complete, and beneath it, the harvest of silence continued, unseen, unchallenged, unstoppable. When the Banwell estate finally fell silent, it was not through confession or discovery but through absence. By the late 19th century, the family line withered as though consumed by the very shadows it had nurtured. The last heirs vanished without explanation, the servants dispersed, and the once bustling chimneys ceased their smoke. The grand house, once admired as a beacon of charity, stood empty, its gardens choking with weeds, its windows staring blankly into the gray sky. For a time, villagers avoided it, unsettled by the silence. Yet curiosity gnawed, and eventually the doors were forced open. What lay inside would haunt Somerset for generations. The halls were dust-choked and cold, but nothing could hide the traces of ritual that lingered. Locked chambers revealed narrow coffins lined with glass, water stains still marking the wood. Wooden wheels leaned against the walls, iron nails rusted but intact, their purpose undeniable to any who stared too long. The chalkboard rooms were filled with unfinished words, phrases scrawled in desperate, childlike script, breaking off mid-sentence as though the hand that wrote them had faltered forever. Every object whispered of suffering, of precision, of patience. This was not a home abandoned in haste but a shrine left behind, as though the Banwells had intended their legacy to be uncovered one day. The most chilling discovery was the Gallery of Stillness. Dust veiled the portraits, but when brushed away, the children's faces stared out with unnerving clarity. Dozens of paintings and photographs lined the walls, each child posed with unnatural symmetry, each right hand placed with ritual care. Some eyes were closed, others wide and hollow, staring past the frame into eternity. The silence of the gallery was oppressive, suffocating. Investigators reported the uncanny sensation of being watched, of being judged by eyes that should have been innocent but now carried only absence. On the floor, beneath the images, lay boxes filled with artifacts. Locks of hair, tiny plaster casts of hands, rosaries made of polished bone. These were not mementos but trophies, relics of cruelty elevated to devotion. Beneath the house, in cellars thick with damp, lay the remains. Skeletal bodies bound in ways no burial could explain. Arms locked behind backs, fingers fused into claws, jaws forced open with wooden wedges. Some lay in mirrored positions, left and right twisted into grotesque symmetries, bones permanently shaped by torture. The arrangement of the remains was deliberate, as if even in death the children had been posed to serve a doctrine. Each skeleton was a final entry in the Banwell's ledger, a last page in their scripture of correction. The silence of the cellar was unbearable, not the peaceful stillness of the grave but the suffocated quiet of lives extinguished too soon. The discovery rippled outward like a contagion. The villagers, once proud of their charitable neighbors, recoiled in horror. Whispers became cries, disbelief gave way to denial. Some insisted the evidence was fabricated, that enemies of the family had staged the horror. Others clung to the belief that the Banwells had been misunderstood, that the children had died of illness, that the relics were exaggerations. But the weight of the gallery, the precision of the ledgers, and the sheer number of bones made denial impossible. The truth had bled through the mask at last, staining the reputation that had shielded the Banwells for decades. For the investigators, the most disturbing element was not simply the cruelty but the order. These were not acts of passion, not murders born of rage or neglect. They were ritualized, codified, repeated with the patience of belief. The Banwells had not seen themselves as killers but as saviors. Their doctrine of correction followed with unwavering faith. The evidence did not reveal madness but conviction, a family that had built an entire theology on suffering. It was this clarity, this methodical devotion that horrified most. Evil had not screamed in the Banwell estate. It had whispered, prayed, and documented itself with tidy handwriting. The ruins spoke in silence, and that silence unsettled all who entered. Clergymen visited to offer prayers but fled quickly, unsettled by the feeling that their words dissolved into the air. Officials sealed the estate, declaring it unfit for habitation, but still the story spread. Children in the village whispered that they heard weeping from its windows at night. Farmers passing by swore they saw candlelight flicker in the gallery, though no one had entered for weeks. The house became both cursed and sacred, a place of warning, a scar etched into the land. Over time, the Banwell estate crumbled. Roofs collapsed, ivy devoured the walls, and the gardens returned to wildness. But the memory of its chambers, of the gallery, of the cellar filled with bound skeletons, endured in whispers. The villagers no longer spoke of charity when they spoke of the Banwells. They spoke of masks, of how evil had walked among them disguised as piety, how they themselves had chosen blindness. The estate had been a monument to deception, and in its ruins, the truth finally had a voice. Yet even as the house decayed, the legacy remained unsettled. Questions lingered in records and minds alike. How many children had passed through those doors? How many bones remained undiscovered in the soil beyond the cellar? How far had the Banwells' influence spread, and who had enabled them in silence? These questions had no answers, only shadows. And perhaps that was the final cruelty of the Banwells, that their deeds left behind not only suffering but uncertainty, an absence of truth that gnawed as much as the horror itself. The ruins spoke, but what they said was fragmented, broken, incomplete. They told of suffering, of silence, of evil clothed in charity. They told of a community that chose comfort over truth, and of children whose voices were erased but whose absence screamed louder than words. The Banwells themselves were gone, swallowed by time, but their house remained a testament to the endurance of cruelty hidden behind masks. In its silence, the ruins demanded a reckoning, a reflection on how such horrors could thrive unchecked. And as the last investigators left the estate, closing its doors forever, the question lingered in the still air. If such evil could grow behind the mask of kindness once, what would stop it from growing again? The Banwell estate collapsed into ruin, but the silence it left behind did not vanish. It clung to Somerset, heavy as fog, pressing on the minds of those who remembered the family not as monsters but as saints. The truth, once unearthed, created fractures in the village's memory. Some refused to believe it, insisting that the relics and bones were fabrications, that the Banwells had been misunderstood. Others could not look away from the gallery, from the chalk-smeared walls, from the coffins lined with glass. They accepted the horror but carried shame, knowing they had praised the Banwells, had defended them, had chosen blindness when the truth had whispered in their ears for decades. That shame lingered like a second death, a slow suffocation of the community's soul. Authorities attempted to shape the discovery into something orderly. Investigations were launched, records scoured, reports written in stiff language that stripped the horror into lists of evidence. Ledgers catalogued artifacts, skeletons were measured, portraits logged. But no report could contain the weight of what had happened, because the true crime was not only the killing of children but the transformation of suffering into ritual. The Banwells had built an entire theology of cruelty, and no legal language could capture the devotion with which they carried it out. Their belief had been so steady, so methodical, that it resisted definition. Was it madness? Was it faith? Was it simply evil? Officials closed their books without answers, filing the case away as an aberration, something too monstrous to explain. Yet the legacy could not be buried as easily as the remains. Laws began to change. Adoption practices, once informal and easily manipulated, were tightened. Records were centralized, inspections increased, oversight demanded. No longer could a family take children into their home with only whispered promises of charity. The Banwells' crimes had exposed the fragility of trust, and in their aftermath, the state stepped in where faith had once ruled. But the changes came too late for the children whose silence filled the cellars, too late for the voices erased before anyone thought to listen. Their absence became the foundation for reform, their suffering turned into policy, their lives remembered only in rules meant to protect the next generation. The villagers built a small memorial, a stone marker erected on the overgrown grounds of the estate. It bore no names, for the names were gone, lost to fire, to ledgers burned, to deliberate erasure. It simply read, "To the children taken." Flowers were placed there each spring, though fewer with each passing year, until the ritual itself faded. By the turn of the century, the Banwell story was half forgotten, spoken only in hushed tones, passed down as caution or legend. The silence remained, not broken but reshaped, carried as myth rather than truth. In this way, the Banwells triumphed even in their ruin, for the clarity of their crimes dissolved into shadows. But the gallery haunted more than Somerset. Scholars stumbled upon its fragments in archives, photographs tucked into collections, reports hidden in government files. Writers spoke of the Banwells as a symbol of the dangers of unchecked piety, of cruelty cloaked in kindness. Others dismissed the tale as exaggeration, as folklore grown grotesque in retelling. And so the silence remained, not in the absence of words but in the flood of uncertainty. Was it true? Was it embellished? Did such horrors really thrive unnoticed for decades? The lack of certainty became its own form of silence, a refusal of society to look too long at what had happened in those halls. The psychology of the Banwells demands reflection even now. Their cruelty was not wild or chaotic but calm, patient, methodical. They smiled in church, donated to the poor, built schools and prayed loudly. They did everything society admires, and behind that mask they built a cathedral of suffering. Evil does not always arrive with rage or bloodied hands. Sometimes it arrives with a smile, with charity, with prayer. Sometimes it thrives precisely because it does not look like evil at all. The Banwells understood this and they exploited it with perfection. Their legacy forces us to ask whether kindness itself can be trusted, whether the very acts we admire most might conceal their opposite. This is why their story endures. It is not simply about the deaths of children, though that horror is enough. It is about how society chooses blindness, how communities embrace illusions because the truth is unbearable. The villagers saw children vanish, heard rumors, noticed silences too heavy for innocence. But they chose admiration over suspicion. They chose comfort over truth. The Banwell's true accomplices were not the servants or the clergy or the state, but the neighbors who smiled at them in church and whispered admiration in the square. The illusion of charity survived because people wanted it to survive, because they needed it to shield themselves from a darker reality. And so the silence that remains is not only the silence of the dead but the silence of complicity. It is the silence of communities that prefer lies, of institutions that look away, of people who convince themselves that evil cannot exist behind a gentle smile. That silence stretches forward in time, a warning that what happened in the Banwell estate can happen again, not in the same form, not with the same rituals, but in the same disguise. For evil thrives best not when it is loud, but when it is polite, when it is cloaked in goodness, when it is hidden in plain sight. Today the ruins of the Banwell estate are gone, reclaimed by earth, but the silence endures. It endures in archives, in whispers, in the unease that lingers when we hear of those who present themselves as saviors. It endures in the question no memorial, no law, no sermon can erase. How many other masks have we mistaken for kindness? How many other Banwells walk among us, smiling, praised, admired, while their cruelty thrives in silence? The Banwell story is not a tale of the past alone. It is a mirror held up to every age, a reflection of the human desire to believe in goodness, even when goodness is only a mask. It is a reminder that evil does not need to shout to win. It only needs to whisper, to smile, to be patient. And when the silence grows thick enough, it can consume generations before anyone dares to break it. So we are left with a question, the same question whispered in the ruins, the same question the gallery seemed to ask with every hollow stare. What do you think? Could this happen again?